Hello, this is Malachi Bishop. This is RC-750, Rehabilitation Counseling, Research and Program Evaluation, Week 3, and we're in Section 3, and this week we are talking about qualitative research and qualitative research design. So we will be looking at the characteristics of qualitative research, some of the fundamental ideas and principles involved in qualitative research, and then we will be looking at qualitative research designs, qualitative research data collection methods, and some other issues related to analyzing and sampling and ethical questions in qualitative research. So to begin, the idea of qualitative research is that the thing that we are trying to understand, the question that we are trying to answer and gain some perspective about, is the perspective of those most directly affected by the phenomenon under study. And as opposed to quantitative research, where the unit of analysis is numbers, in qualitative research, the unit of analysis is words or verbal data. So it could be sentences, phrases, and other forms of language or linguistic structure. And interestingly, the instrument of data collection in qualitative research is the researcher him or herself, and that has some important implications. So when we say the instrument of data collection is the researcher, that means that the researcher becomes an integral part of the research process itself, because the accuracy of the research findings depends upon the researcher's ability to accurately record and interpret the information gathered. So we talk about the reliability and validity of research instruments when we talk about quantitative data. The same issue with qualitative research. If the instrument is the researcher, then it's critical that the researcher be valid and reliable and very careful in the collection, analysis, and interpretation of the data. So we'll talk about the variety of ways in which we do that. But essentially, in order to do this effectively, he or she must first of all be knowledgeable about the topic that he or she is studying, knowledgeable about the participants, and as I said, very careful and deliberate about accurately collecting and analyzing and reporting the data. Let's look at a few assumptions and principles of qualitative research. First is that qualitative research is conducted not in laboratories generally, but out there in natural settings where people are, where they live, work, and play. So qualitative research is conducted in natural settings. We say that categories are discovered rather than overlaid or predetermined. So in qualitative research, we are interested in finding out rather than coming in with a theory and seeing if our theory is correct. And this next point refers to that. We say analysis is inductive, and that means that our conclusions, our theory emerges from the research, emerges from the data, rather than deductive, which places a predetermined framework on the research process and the data collection and analysis. So essentially, deductive means we come in with a theory, and then we collect data, and we try to see if the data confirms our theory. In the inductive process, we begin with the data, we begin with the research process, and we develop a theory as a result of that process. And then research data are descriptive. In qualitative research, we said the data are words or language. So it's a rich and descriptive form of research data. Why do we use the qualitative research method? What's the purpose? The intent of qualitative research is to uncover meaning rather than verify causal relationships between variables. And qualitative research is used for exploring or investigating phenomena that are not well understood. It's used for explaining phenomena when there is a need to explain phenomena we don't understand or we want to learn more about, something that happens, something that is occurring. And then describing. Frequently, qualitative research is used to describe, document, and describe phenomena that are occurring. A few other characteristics of qualitative research identified by Cresswell in the text there. We said that the research occurs in a natural setting. The researcher is a key instrument in the data collection. We strive for multiple sources of data. So if we really want to deeply understand a phenomenon, an event, a culture, whatever it is, then our process is improved by collecting data from multiple sources. We said we use an inductive data analysis process. We are trying to understand the phenomena or the event or whatever it is that we are trying to understand from the perspective of the participants. Analysis is interpretive. We are trying to collect data and then make an interpretation, hopefully a valid interpretation of the data, the information that we collect. And qualitative research involves a holistic account. We are trying to understand the person, the people, the situation holistically and broadly. Let's talk about a few qualitative research designs now. We're going to talk about ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, and case study. An ethnography, qualitative research design, is one in which we explore shared patterns of behavior or values, beliefs, language in a group of people who interact over time. So looking at the word ethnography, it gives you a clue that we are talking about groups of people, right? So ethnography is a design intended to understand the norms, experiences, etc. of a culture, a group of participants by gathering data through talking or listening or observing behavior. Ethnography provides an approach to understanding people in natural settings. Groups of people in their natural settings. It's used mostly to study human cultures. And data can be collected in a variety of ways, as we said. The next research design is called phenomenological research design or phenomenology. And again, there's a clue in the word itself, phenomenon. So it tells us that we are interested in learning about an individual's experience with some phenomenon, some experience or some event, and understanding the essential nature of some lived experience. So the subjective world of the participant, how the person interprets and gives meaning to the experience. And we do this without coming in with a research theory, but rather coming in with an open perspective and saying, what was it like for you to have this experience? What did it mean to you? And we typically conduct phenomenological research using extensive data collection, sometimes through prolonged interaction, typically with a small group of people who shared some experience. An example of this would be If you wanted to learn about the experiences of people with disabilities or some particular disability or type of condition in New Orleans after the Katrina. So that was a phenomenon, that was an event, and we might be very interested in learning about the experiences of people after Katrina. And there are a number of reasons why we would want to do that. So phenomenology would be pursuing a better understanding of the subjective experience of those people in order to give meaning to and understand the meaning that they give to that experience. An example of phenomenological qualitative research study in the Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin 2009 was provided by Hunt, Milson, and Matthews. And let me recommend this particular study article because it really identifies a lot of the analytical processes we'll be talking about, a lot of the ethical considerations we'll be talking about. This one is really an excellent example of a well-done qualitative research study. And so Hunt, Milsom, and Matthews were interested in understanding the rehabilitation experiences of lesbians with physical disabilities. And they interviewed 25 lesbians with physical disabilities about their perspectives on their partner related experiences of rehabilitation, how the disability affected the partnership, and how treatment as a lesbian couple by rehabilitation professionals. And the method in this approach, because they were interested in women's lived experiences as lesbians with physical disabilities, they used a phenomenological approach, as I said, namely because it provides a framework for describing the women's individual experiences with a phenomenon of interest. So if you're interested in seeing a fine article on using a phenomenological approach, I recommend that one. Another research design or approach in qualitative research is the case study, which is an in-depth exploration of generally a single subject, but not necessarily a single person, but a case. And Freud's work, Sigmund Freud's work in the development of psychoanalysis, included much case study. Another more contemporary example would be Oliver Sacks, who you might be familiar with. He's the person who wrote Awakenings and a number of excellent books like The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and some more recently. But he's a neurologist who basically writes case studies, very interesting neurological phenomenon. So if you're familiar with Oliver Sacks, that will give you a good idea of what we're talking about when we talk about a case study approach. I said it's not necessarily an individual, but sometimes case study involves exploring the single individual, a person. Sometimes it is a larger group or collective, so it could be subunits within a larger case. And then data collection in case study approaches generally involves observation, interview, document review, audio or visual material, and other sorts of reports that are available. So a case can be an individual, a case can be a group or subunit. We'll look at an example here of each of those. This one is from the Rehabilitation Counseling Literature, Davis, 2009, in the Journal of Applied Rehabilitation Counseling, provided an example of a case study concerning the adjustment to threat in the workplace. It's an interesting case study in the rehabilitation counseling literature. And then from the Counseling and Therapy for Couples and Families journal. This was a study in 2000 by Wyckoff and Cameron, where the focus was a family. So not a single individual, but a case study of a group, in this case a family, in which they examined the impact of sociocultural and environmental stressors of alcohol abuse and dependence in a particular Hispanic family system. This too presents a good example of a case study. Then the other approach we're talking about is grounded theory. And grounded theory, what we're talking about is generating a theory, describing or explaining a phenomenon. So the key is that we are generating a theory. We are using an inductive process of gathering data and generating a theory based on the data, okay, instead of the deductive process of starting with the theory and then testing it. Theory development is grounded in real-world data collection. That's how you can think of that one. And grounded theory involves a cyclical process of a theoretical data collection, and then the researchers will begin to identify relationships that they are seeing in the data that they're collecting. They'll segment, encode, and develop categories in the data and try to identify relationships, and then based on the relationships that they see, they may begin to generate a theory. They will then engage in the process of corroborating and validating the results, collecting data, and then basically testing the theory, moderating or developing the theory further. But the idea is it's a continual process of developing theory from the data that you collect. An example from the rehabilitation counseling literature, Liza Conyers, 2004, in the Rehabilitation Counseling Bulletin, expanding understanding of HIV/AIDS and employment using focus groups. She developed, using a grounded theory approach, some work in developing a theory about employment-related issues and concerns of individuals with HIV or AIDS diagnoses. Another example, Tingey, Mellington, and Schultz, 2009, in the Journal of Applied Rehabilitation Counseling, used a grounded theory approach to defining fragmentation and unification in the rehabilitation counseling profession. So they looked at fragmentation in the rehabilitation counseling profession and proposed a framework for a grounded theory concerning that issue. All right, let's talk about sampling in qualitative research. If the goal of qualitative research is to understand the individual's or culture's experience, subjective experience of a phenomenon, then it is critical that we carefully select a sample of different groups and individuals, particularly for the perspectives that they have. Different samples will provide different perspectives. Qualitative research typically involves smaller samples than quantitative research, but we collect much more extensive data from these smaller groups. So smaller samples in qualitative research, but more rich and more extensive data than in quantitative research. All right, when we are talking about sampling, selecting participants in qualitative research, we may approach this for a number of reasons. Our purpose may be maximum variation, so we may want to identify people with the most varied perspectives possible, or minimum variation. So we might be interested in people with similar views, or less variation, the least amount of variation, because we want the people to have the same perspective. We might be interested in selecting cases in order to meet some specific criterion. So we want people to have some specific characteristic that we are interested in learning more about. We may select people that manifest a particular theoretical or operational construct. It may be that we select in order to assure groups that will provide confirming or disconfirming evidence that will reflect stratification. So we might be interested in particular subgroups of a population, maybe to assure reflecting a combination or mix of characteristics, and then sometimes to have randomly selected cases within large samples. The point of this is it's important that you have a defensible rationale, that you have a reason for selecting the people that you are selecting to be participants in your study. In other words, that you spend some time thinking about that. And there are a few different approaches in qualitative research. Comprehensive sampling, for example, is a method in which all cases are examined. So here we're trying to have gain a comprehensive perspective by talking to or collecting data about everybody who's involved. So for example, it might be you want to talk to all the members of some rehabilitation facility, all the people who experience some phenomena. So that's comprehensive sampling. Maximum variation sampling is purposefully selecting a wide range of cases to account for all perspectives, age ranges, cultures. So the point is you want maximum variation. You want to understand perspectives very broadly across a group or culture. So you might, for example, want the perspective of Republicans and Democrats, people who are pro and con some issue, people who are young and old. You want the maximum amount of variation so that you can understand the phenomenon under study. Homogeneous sampling means selecting a small homogeneous group for intensive study. So homogeneous means that they are similar, they are the same on some characteristic, and generally talking about studying a small group with some specific characteristic. In extreme case sampling, we would be choosing people with an extreme view because we're interested in understanding that view and why people would have that view or that perspective. So, for example, members of hate groups, some perspective that we want to understand better, we would obviously we would select people who participated in that extreme case, extreme phenomena. So we would select people from a particular perspective. Typical case sampling is where you're interested in selecting the average cases. So not the extremes, but you want the typical to get a sense of the typical experience. And then convenience sampling is, as it suggests, taking those people who are available to the researcher, people who are most convenient, and so frequently students. If the researchers are in universities and colleges, then students are very frequently sampled. And then the snowball approach, where the subjects themselves act as recruiters or identify the next participant for the researcher. So the researcher learns about other potential participants from the participants that they are currently collecting data from. There are a variety of methods, we've talked about some of them, of collecting data in qualitative research. Depending on your purpose and the topic of your research, data collection methods might include field notes and naturalistic observation and taking notes of what you see in natural settings. So observing people in their natural environments and taking field notes. You may be involved in document review, so reviewing historical or existing documentation. Interviews, which may be informal, spontaneous, and unstructured. And just sort of, I'm interested in your perspective. Tell me about it, but I have no specific questions. We're just going to see where this goes, and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. Or you could have more guided interviews where the interviewer has some specific topics that he or she wants to cover, but there is a loose structure of the questioning. And then standardized interviews, which are very structured and guided, and there isn't leeway for taking different directions. Basically, you ask the questions the same way every time, and everything is standardized. Focus groups we'll talk about in a minute, but that's a very useful way of collecting data in qualitative research. And then surveys. We tend to think of surveys as used for quantitative research, but obviously surveys can also be used to collect qualitative data, right? You can collect language, verbal information, words and sentences by way of surveys as well. So when we talk about surveys, we'll talk more about that. But I said focus groups are frequently used. They are frequently used in rehabilitation counseling research, certainly. Generally, a focus group involves 8 to 12 people. You don't really want to get more than that, because you generally are talking about meeting for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And 8 to 12 seems to be the number of people where within the time frame that you have, you will be able to hear from everybody in a manageable way. It's not too small and not too large that people feel excluded or don't have the chance to participate, and it's not too difficult to manage. So that's a good size to shoot for focus groups. Generally, the focus group members will be homogeneous in terms of some characteristic that you are interested in studying. So they'll be the same in terms of some characteristic under study, but they will be different. They'll have heterogeneous views, so they'll have different experiences. So in other words, I recently did some focus groups with people with epilepsy. So they're homogeneous with respect to living with epilepsy and having worked or tried to work as a person with epilepsy, but they were very different in terms of their views and experiences. The conversation within the focus group is generally either video or audio taped. Or maybe notes can be taken, but it's much easier to record and have a note taker. And then the focus group is moderated by the researcher. And focus groups require a few things. They require thinking about planning, translating the research purpose into a set of relevant questions is an important first part of your planning. You have some question you want to learn more about. You have some people who are coming to talk about it. Your first step in planning a focus group is to identify some questions that you specifically want to hear people tell you about. So translating the purpose into relevant questions that can guide the discussion. Recruiting. You have to think about, do you want homogeneity or heterogeneity with regard to different characteristics? Remember, we talked about sampling. Do you want people who are mostly the same, mostly different, very different, and so on? So you have to think about your recruitment. Moderation. So if you think about collecting data in this sort of loose approach, with a group of 8 to 12 people. Moderating a focus group requires your counseling skills. It requires your ability to draw people out in some cases, and direct people and redirect people and make sure that everybody is having a chance to speak. It is a focused and sometimes taxing job to be the moderator. You have to be very attentive to the group and really pay attention to the dynamics and things like that. But it's also very enjoyable and rewarding, and certainly an excellent way to collect qualitative data. And then you have to think about the analysis and interpretation of the results. The results, the interpretation, should capture the range of impressions and observations on each topic, and you have to be careful about interpreting them in light of the hypotheses that you might want to test. And we'll talk about the importance of being careful in interpretation in just a minute. So in focus group discussions, the important things to do are know your objectives, know what you want to accomplish, have the issues or questions that you want to discuss, have them ready. Don't try to do too much. It sounds like a long time, an hour and a half to 2 hours, but it actually goes very quickly. 2 to 4 major topics is generally what you can cover in that amount of time with that number of people. Have an outline of how you want to proceed. Be ready to be flexible. Things can go in directions that you weren't expecting, and if the directions are potentially fruitful, then be ready to go in that direction. So be ready to follow the discussion where it leads, but also be ready to rein in, and I spelled rein wrong there, but rein in the discussion when necessary, because the conversation can also go in unfruitful directions. Stick to the time limit, and preferably use 2 people to moderate, one to guide the discussion and one to take notes. Said there will be videotaping or audio taping. I generally use audio taping because I think people are generally more comfortable with audio than videotaping, but both can be very effective. I said sometimes note-taking is used, but it's much more reliable if you have a backup recording of the session. And then take notes at the end of each focus group session. While the information is fresh in your mind, identify the important themes, the ideas, the thoughts that you had that may structure future groups' questions, and also that may help guide you in your interpretation of the data. Let's talk about data analysis now. How can we organize, interpret, and use verbal data? So we have a better sense probably of organizing and interpreting and using numeric data, but how can we structure in a meaningful way people's words and sentences and so on? And generally the way this works is that the researchers try to identify relationships or themes or patterns within the language. And we may segment, code, and create categories based on these relationships or themes that we see. And then we engage in a process of corroborating and validating the results. And then frequently the information will be presented visually using diagrams, tables, matrices, and graphs. But other forms of summary are also typically used. We'll talk about that in a minute. The coding process, so we're talking about identifying themes, looking for patterns in what the people are telling us. The coding process may involve an inductive process where the codes emerge based on our analysis of the data. So we just look at the data and we start to see themes emerge and we start to code them. And coding means basically here putting a label on the themes that we see. So for example, if we see a lot of people talking about, let's say in my example of epilepsy focus groups. Let's say a lot of people start to say that if you disclose your epilepsy, then you get a certain response. That might be a theme that we start to see, and so we would code that. We would put it in a group. We would identify that meaningful pattern, and we would call it disclosure-related responses or something like that. So we are putting a name on it, we're coding it, and it's emerging from what we see. Coding may also be a priori, which means we have predetermined codes. So we have ideas about what we are expecting to find beforehand, and then we take the data and we put it into these predetermined categories. And it may be mixed, where we have predetermined codes. We put the data in there, into our various codes as we find it, but then we also see new patterns or themes emerging that didn't fit in our predetermined coding. And so we develop new codes, and that's a mixed approach. All right, so in terms of validity and reliability, general validity concerns the degree to which an account is accurate or truthful. And in qualitative research, validity concerns the degree to which a finding is judged to have been interpreted in a correct way. So we want to make sure that as researchers we are interpreting the data the correct way, which means accurately, truthfully, and in the way that it is related to us as well. So types of validity in qualitative research include descriptive validity, which means factual accuracy of the account or the information that we collect. Then we also talk about interpretive validity, which is as much as possible using people's words, or concepts, or perceptions. So using rather than interpreting and changing, but as much as possible using people's expressions, words, and so on. And then theoretical validity articulates or formulates a model of relationships as they are postulated to exist between salient variables or concepts. We also talk about external validity, which refers to generalizability. In other words, can we say that what we have identified in this group can be generalized to other populations? Reliability concerns the ability of different researchers to make the same observations of a given phenomenon if and when the observation is conducted using the same methods and procedures. Researchers can enhance the reliability of a qualitative research by standardizing data collection techniques and protocols, making sure that we're using the same data collection techniques. So careful documentation enhances reliability. And then inter-rater reliability, which is a process of evaluating whether 2 or 3 different people who analyze the data analyzed it basically in the same way, saw the same things in the same way. So this is a consideration during the analysis phase. So some ethical considerations to quickly talk about and identify include obviously gaining IRB approval and collecting research consent, informed consent from participants, identifying a research problem that will benefit participants, ensuring the same purpose exists and is understood between the researcher and the participants, making sure that you are in agreement about the purpose and the purpose of the research is clear to the participants, respecting vulnerable populations, taking particular care to protect privacy and confidentiality. Frequently we're talking about very personal, obviously, perspectives. So protecting privacy and confidentiality is critical in this as in other forms of research. Using anonymity to do that, to promote that protection, and then trying to eliminate bias in your analysis and writing. final point I'd like to make is that we are seeing much more qualitative research than we used to in the rehabilitation counseling research, and that's a great thing. Really started to see it really quite recently in the rehabilitation counseling research in the 70s and 80s, began to emerge, increased significantly in the 90s, and has really become quite a strong part of our research tradition in the last 2 decades. So we are increasingly seeing qualitative research in the rehab counseling literature, either as a primary method of gaining knowledge or sometimes as an added dimension in quantitative studies, where, for example, we collect both quantitative information. So, for example, in client satisfaction research, we collect number data, like how satisfied were you with your experience in vocational rehabilitation on a scale from 1 to 5. But then we also collect qualitative data. What in particular did you like or not like? And that approach is called mixed method, and you will probably have already been hearing more about that, and you will continue to, but that's what that means. All right, so that concludes our week 3 discussion and our discussion of qualitative research design and methods.